The Labor government has changed its tack on the way it opposes the idea of nuclear energy in Australia. Now, as we observed here several weeks ago, the demonising of nuclear power would only play into the hands of Peter Dutton and the opposition. So in the past couple of weeks, there's been polling that shows nuclear energy is increasingly popular among younger voters, traditionally the Labor heartland. Now, the government has three key defences against the concept of nuclear energy. One is that it's simply too expensive to roll it out. Two is that it will take too long to implement. And the third is the idea that a government-owned nuclear industry will send mixed price messages to other energy companies right now planning renewables projects. Decisions, as a result, could be deferred, making our energy outcomes even worse. But some do argue strongly that nuclear, regardless of all this, should play a key role in our energy future. And one of those is Aidan Morrison, the Policy Director of Energy Research at the Centre for Independent Studies. And I spoke with him a little earlier.
I think the Labor Party has realised now that Australians aren't very impressed about the old scaremongering and sort of saying this is not safe. It's been proven very, very safe around the world. So they're having to shift on those serious arguments, the questions about cost and whether we actually need it for the reliability of our system and whether we can get it in an appropriate amount of time. So that's the only contest. But I think that more that debate plays out, the more it becomes clear that actually the cost is quite competitive and really we're only just discovering the true cost of the renewable energy rollout, which is not proceeding anywhere like as fast or as cheaply as what has been planned.
But I've heard the Energy Minister, Chris Bowen, continually roll out the CSIRO numbers, pointing out that to actually put in a nuclear industry in Australia would be way more expensive than your renewables that are already in the pipeline and coming.
And I think that's where I disagree with Chris Bowen, basically, because if you look a little bit closer at the CSIRO numbers, they actually present a large range, a big band for nuclear energy, and the bottom of that band is very close to the top of the band for the renewable energy. So it's not actually a very big gap. And the reason you should only look at the bottom of the band, because that's the part where they consider actually using a nuclear power plant properly. The assumption that leads to those higher costs is that we build an expensive nuclear power plant and then only use it about 50 or 60% of the time. There's no reason at all in Australia that we should do that. If we build a nuclear power plant, we should use it 90% of the time, which is what most other countries around the world do. And that brings your cost for the delivered energy right back down to a point that's very competitive with renewable energy. And the renewable energy that CSIRO has modelled, that's the idealised version, the best version that their model could spit out. The actual version that we're building here in Australia is totally different, and the biggest exemplar of that is offshore wind, which is something like 3 times the cost of onshore wind. CSIRO's model doesn't build any offshore wind because it's too expensive. So in reality, the true costs are going to be much, much higher than CSIRO's band of renewable energy costs.
OK, so then we come back to the actual nuclear debate itself. One of the simplest things for the Labor government to do, I would imagine, is simply lift the ban on nuclear and allow the market to work out whether they want to produce wind or whether they want to produce solar, pumped hydro, or whether they want to produce nuclear. That would be the most obvious thing to do for Australia's future energy needs.
I think that would be politically definitely a very smart thing for the Labor government to do because it neutralises the coalition's kind of suggestion that nuclear energy is important and we need that reliable power and trying to say that let the market decide. I've actually written a report, though, suggesting that often the market has not built nuclear energy in the places where it's turned out to be the lowest cost. In lots of places around the world, it has been the government that has led the development of nuclear energy. Sometimes the operations are then handed over to private operators. But there is not a long track record of purely private start-up nuclear industries around the world. So I actually think it's relatively sensible. The coalition has recognised they'll have to back the first mover and make the big decisions about how much we need and where it needs to go in the grid. I think that is what's required to invest at the sort of scale that's required to make nuclear most economical. But absolutely, I think that Labor have painted themselves in a corner now by having to say that we have to keep it totally banned because there's clearly no good reason at all to keep this energy source banned.
All right, but the other problem that Peter Dutton's plan would have is that they would have to get approvals from state governments, which are largely Labor governments right now. So that's another hurdle. If you actually wanted to put those nuclear plants, be they small modular reactors or bigger reactors, into sites of existing coal-fired power stations.
That's a really good question. I've heard different opinions on this. There is actually an argument that the federal government might have provisions, if it's to meet an international treaty obligation, such as our net zero Paris commitments, to actually override state authority on this. I'm not sure. I'm not a legal expert on that matter. But I think the political question will be solved quite quickly. Simply put, if Peter Dutton wins this election, if they get a clear mandate on the referendum for nuclear, which the opposition said they want to have, if that referendum comes in and says Australia wants nuclear, I don't think the state governments are actually going to be holding up the show very long at all, because they'll see the writing on the wall that the Australian people are clearly behind this source of energy, and I think they'll fall in very quickly into line, just as you saw federal Labor do behind AUKUS. Once we've finally broken through that barrier and committed to it, and the Australian people haven't reacted, I think all that resistance is going to evaporate quite quickly. So I'm not particularly concerned about the state governments remaining a problem. The question is whether the Australian people demonstrate very clearly that they're behind this energy source.
And the interesting thing about the Australian people right now is they're worried about their cost of living and therefore their energy bills now and in the future. And they're worried about the future sustainability of our energy grid, with question marks all the time about East Coast gas shortages and or electricity shortages in the worst seasonal conditions, up that East Coast. Now, that is about whether the lights stay on or not.
Certainly is. So I think that's where the critical political question will be answered, is when people ask themselves, what will give me low-cost, reliable electricity? They're going to be weighing up these questions. What do I believe? Is it Chris Bowen's read of the CSIRO report? Or do we look at other countries around the world and see how does energy supply look in those places that use quite a bit of nuclear energy, and looking at those prices there?
Aidan Morrison, great to chat to you today. Many thanks for your time. We'll do it again very shortly.
Thanks very much, Ross.